Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome back to the Friendship Quilt Along. Today, we are piecing this beautiful scrappy block and getting a little bit more practice in with those square and a square units. So let's jump on the machine and have this super scrappy adventure together. So this block is going to begin with some square and a square units. And the first step is to piece a set of large units. And you can see here we have the triangles cut out of fabric B, and then this big square in the center is fabric A. That's the scrappy square. Now we have some smaller square and a square units that are made the opposite, so that the fabric A is the triangles and the fabric B is the center. So refer to your pattern and piece these together carefully. And I do have another tutorial on making square and a square units, so make sure to check out that video so you can get some tips on putting this together. And I always piece 2 triangles to 2 sides first, then I trim off those edges, and then I piece the second 2 triangles on the opposite sides. But definitely watch that video for tips. Okay. So to lay this out, I'm going to take my largest square and a square blocks and set them up like this. And then I already pieced 4 fabric A scrappy squares together into a little row, and that is acting as sashing. So once you get this pieced like this, then it's going to be a simple process of putting this together in rows, just like all of the blocks we've created so far. So I'm just going to flip this over, place a clip, flip the next block over and place a clip. And this is just clipping it generally. You know, I'm not aligning the fabrics, and being really picky or persnickety here. I'm just simply getting this lined up so that way I can take it to the machine and I don't get confused as to what is being pieced to what. It's really easy when I'm just stacking stuff together and there's no clips or pins in it, to get kind of distracted. And when sometimes it might be a couple days before I get to my machine too, and I might accidentally, forget what I'm doing and not piece something accurately. So that's something to watch out for, and that's why I always run through this system carefully, flipping everything over and clipping it in place. Okay, so we have our rows. Let's get on the machine and piece this together. So I am piecing on the Eversewn Sparrow 20, and you can learn more about my sewing machine at leahday.com/sew20. I have my normal straight stitch with my needle in the center position, and I have lowered my stitch length to 1.5 millimeters so it produces a nice, tight, consistent stitch. And I do that so I can press my seam allowances open. And you can see I've already done that to those pieces that I've already stitched together. Okay, so whenever I am piecing something together, I always take a look at it and just check in on seam allowance. This is just a little thing, but I think it does make a big difference. And I don't have very much seam allowance on this side. I have quite a lot on this side. So I'm going to flip that over so that way the side with more seam allowance is on top. There we go. And I'm just going to line that up so those pieces are in perfect alignment along that right side and along that top edge. That looks good. And then I'm going to slide this. Actually, first I want to make sure my needle is in the down position. That's really important. So that way I can lift the foot slightly and slip those pieces under the foot and right up against that needle. So there we go, that feels good. And then the first stitch I take is going to be right onto those fabrics. So once I get a needle in it, I start taking a look down here, and I will be honest, I piece these pieces together on my treadle, and I think that seam allowance is running small. I think it's running scant because I'm looking right here and I have quite a lot of fabric left over, about 1/8 of an inch. And that would definitely make sense. If every single one of these seams here is running small, then that would make sense that I'd have too much left over down here. And I already kind of figured that that was going to happen. So a little bit of lesson, whenever you're piecing, try and piece on one machine. Don't switch between machines if you can help it, because sometimes, whether you mean to or not, even if you're using the same foot, sometimes, the same, different machines will piece with a different seam allowance. So watch out for that. I'm going to let that just, run off. I'm basically not going to I'm not going to force fit that together. I'm not going to try and squish the fabrics in and make it fit. Instead, I'm just going to trim off that little excess that I'm going to end up with at the end of those pieces. And that is going to be a-okay. All right, so now I grab my next set of pieces and I'm just stitching right through that short seam. That's the sashing and cornerstone. And then my last row here, let's see if that same issue is popping up for this row. I bet you it is. You know, this is the thing. If you start to notice a piecing issue, such as your seams not coming out right or having lots of excess fabric especially, you know, if it just seems like everything is always too big, if you piece something and then you have something else that it's stitching to, maybe a plain block or square that you're sure is the right size, and the thing that you've pieced and has multiple seam allowances in it is just not fitting, then that's an indication that your seam allowance is just not correct. You know, you got to take away the right amount and in order to end up with pieces the right size. And a good habit to get into, and I should have done this before I began piecing, and that was to measure these sets of pieced blocks, and I did not do that. So one of those kind of active learning tips here. You know, because I could have hidden this mistake. I could have, you know, measured it and then trimmed it short and then pretended it all went out perfectly, but you know, I'd rather just show you the truth. See, I'm going to end up with about 1/8 of an inch of extra fabric on that blue too, and it's consistent. So both of them ended up the exact same length too long, and that lets me know there was definitely a seam allowance issue. It wasn't anything to do with the fabric or the cutting. That was all seam allowance. And that just lets you know across an entire quilt, if you're running with a seam allowance a little bit too small, how much of an impact that could have over an entire quilt. Quite a few inches, let's just put it that way. All right, because I'm dealing with that extra fabric issue, and here you can see it really clearly that much, whenever I stitch the second seam on these rows, I'm going to stitch it from the same direction. So if this happens to you, this is what you should do. I'm going to line this up, and even though I have more seam allowance on that side, I'm going to still put that face down, so that way I can line this up and have that top edge nice and straight and perfectly square. This edge is going to end up coming out the same. When I get finished piecing that, I'm going to trim off that little bit of extra blue. So I'm going to go on ahead and piece these, and I'll show you how to do that next. So I finished piecing these rows together, and I also pressed those seam allowances open and flat, and that's going to also make this easier to trim up. So now I'm going to line up my ruler, and I want to line up basically just the outer edge of those square inner square units with the edge of the ruler. I also want to check in on some thin lines on the ruler just to make sure that it's nice and straight and square to that seam line, and that looks pretty good. Press firmly and trim off just that little bit. This is the reason why I cannot stand piecing with a scant 1/4 inch, because scant 1/4 inch, when you add that together and everything else is consistent, then this is what ends up happening when you're piecing scant 1/4 to something that you know is the correct size. So this was pieced and trimmed to exactly the shape it needed to be. And look how far off it is. You know, that should be lining up theoretically with that seam in the center, and it's not. So that is just one of those frustrating things. I have a whole podcast episode about scant 1/4 inch and how much I absolutely can't stand it for this reason. Scant 1/4, I really feel like it only works when, you know, everything is basically pieced the same size. Like if I had an entire quilt with tiny little squares that size going together, then obviously that would work. But when you're piecing something together then to another bigger shape that's accurate, it's really not going to work consistently. And the other thing about it, I think that scant 1/4 was kind of designed when you press your seam allowances to one side, because you usually end up losing some fabric and losing a little bit of space, and so it's less accurate. So if all of these seams were pressed to one side, if the fabric hadn't been prepped up properly, if the pieces were slightly cut off, then I think maybe then the scant 1/4 would have worked out. And that's just one of those things that I've noticed with piecing on my treadle versus piecing on my regular Eversewn Sparrow 20, is that my treadle naturally does a scant 1/4 because I can't move the needle over. Now, this is going to pose an issue for this center piece, and that is because, you know, the center cornerstone, I want that to go right between, and I want those seam lines to match up. So what I need to do here with this one, because I know this issue is going to happen again, I basically need to trim off that same amount from both ends, or I could try piecing it from the center to the outer edges. You know, I think it'll be easier just to trim it up. So I'm going to line this up, and I know the size of the block that this is being pieced to. So I'm going to back it up. I'm going to line that ruler up and making sure to line up thin lines on the ruler with the edges of that seam, plus the length that I know it needs to be. And I'm just going to trim off that extra. And this is just a trick. If you know that you're going to run into an issue and you're piecing rows together like this, just go on ahead and take the time to trim it up. And I mean, is this a perfect fix? No. If this was a bigger quilt and I was taking this block and, you know, keeping going with it, this might pose some problems further down the road. And it certainly is going to, you know, like right here, those, you know, points should be matching up with that seam line, and it's not. So little things like that will probably be off, but it's a usable enough fix, and as I say, it's good enough for me. So here we go. I think this is the way I had the blocks before, with that strip in the middle. There we go. So I hope that was helpful to see how to correct for that issue. It is very frustrating, and I hope it doesn't happen to you, but it's really good to know how to correct for it. So at this point, all of our strips should be the exact same length. Now take this to the machine. We're going to stitch this to this side, and we'll check that out. Now, because I've had some issues, I'm going to pull back and actually pen this seam. So I'm pulling back on the side with the cornerstone, the nice scrappy blocks, and making sure those seam allowances are stacked up perfectly. I'm going to pinch that between my thumb and index finger and place a pen in the seam allowance right above that seam, because I'm going to stitch this coming down and I want to hit the pen first. I'm not going to hit it, but I want to have the pen be leading that through the machine. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing right here. Make sure that's lined up nicely, flip it over, and place the pen ahead of that seam. There we go. Okay, that looks good. And then now I'm just going to line up that edge with the edge of that square and a square unit. So I'm lining up the right side and the top side here. That looks great. Lift the foot, press those pieces right up against the needle, and get started stitching. And then I'm just going to check in every once in a while and make sure that everything's in nice alignment. And then too, I can use this needle. I know at that point should not move, but if I have a little excess fabric here and these pieces, these fabrics are feeling just a little bit on the loose side, meaning that they were probably starched and cut a while ago, and now they're going a little soft. Starch, you know, softens up on your fabric over time. This is why you should keep your pieces in an airtight container, or just, you know, like a box or a bag or something, so that way they don't soften up too much. And so as I'm going, I'm kind of pulling on that ever so slightly, and that is easing the fabric through and helping it lock together nicely. Okay, I'm going to stitch right up to that pen and then take it out. And then I'm going to use this pen. It's kind of like a fulcrum. I'm just giving it a little tug. There we go. And I use a lot of fingertip pressure. This fingertip in particular, I kind of wear it out. I press down really firmly onto my fabrics, and that helps to line things up. Now, another reason why I don't have to worry so much about these seam allowances on the back flipping over is because I have a queen size Supreme slider here on my machine bed. And you can see this covers up. I've got all these nooks and crannies here that lead up over the bobbin case. And I found when I pieced with that, it would oftentimes catch on my seam allowances and flip them over, which drove me nuts. So by putting this Supreme slider here, it covers it up, and it's like a slip and slide. It really makes it easier to piece. Everything just slips up right to the patchwork foot. And I find that when I don't have one, everything kind of feels stuck on the machine and the table, like it's not moving as easily. And it feels like I have to do more work for it. All right, so now because I've had this, little bit of a piecing issue with this block now, I decided to place a pin right here at the end, and that's just making sure that those edges are, the corners of those pieces is just, they're lining up absolutely perfectly now. And again, if I have that little bit of baggy fabric, which it doesn't look like I have too much of a problem with that, I can just give that a little fingertip tug like that, and that will ease any excess fabric out through that full length of the seam. You know, when you try and ease something out through that much space, you're most likely going to end up with a pleat. If you have 3 or 4 inches with which to ease the fabric, you have so much more of a chance of actually getting it to lay down flat and not causing the fabric to distort or stitch a pleat in it. And in all honesty, none of that is the end of the world. It's really, really not, but I just want you to understand piecing better, why this stuff happens. You know, why did you end up with a pleat in your block? I want you to know so that way you can improve. Okay, one last tip here. This is a scrap charger. I use this at the beginning and end of every single seam. It's just simply 2 layers of fabric held together, and this keeps my machine in stitching mode. So rather than have those long thread tails, which wastes a lot of thread actually, I can just stitch through that, and it's just like chain piecing. I stitch all the way across it, and my machine is still ready to stitch the next set. So from here, I'm just going to press the seam allowance open, and I always finger press like this. Let me move it over so you can see what I'm doing. I use my fingernail and drag it over and really get in there and open up that seam, because when you take an iron to it and try and dig that seam open, it really doesn't work. It doesn't get it nice and flat, and it can easily distort the fabrics. So I always finger press first, and then I press with a hot dry iron. But let's double check, and I think that looks terrific. Now I know that that seam, yep, that's not going to match. And let's check in on these on the sides. Those aren't going to match either. Let's see here. Yeah, that one with the pink isn't going to match. That one with the blue isn't going to match. That's okay. It does not mean that the block is ruined. It is just fine. I'm just going to piece this next one on, making sure that that center seam, those 2 center seams match up nicely right around that cornerstone, and I'm going to be completely satisfied with that. So here is my finished center block, and yes, those seams matched up perfectly around that center square. So something else that was really interesting about this center block is it actually pieced up the correct size. And that might be surprising to you, but when you think about it, it actually makes sense. I used the scant quarter because I pieced these seams on my treadle, and that was through these sections, right? And that just determined the width of those areas. And then I fixed that by trimming off that little bit of extra fabric from each of those ends. So that did not affect the seams that controlled the width of the block overall. Now, if I had continued piecing with scant quarter on my treadle, these seams where the rows came together, just like that, then that would have been off, and the entire block would have been off a little bit and running too big, but it actually ended up coming out exactly the right size. So I hope that you enjoyed this little lesson about scant quarter versus true quarter inch. And really the key here, just in case you're curious or confused at all, scant quarter is the idea of stitching within a quarter inch by 1 thread width. Now, how much 1 thread width is anybody's guess. And some feet are designed specifically to make that happen for you. Some feet are not. That's part of the reason why it's so confusing. And I think the number 1 key here is to measure your seams and then know what something is supposed to come out. So if you take and piece things together, how you can calculate what size it needs to come out to is you add up all of the numbers without their seam allowance. So subtract a 1/2 inch, okay, and you add up everything without that 1/2 inch seam allowance, that's your number, and then you add back just 1/2 inch, that's the outer edge, that's what it should be. And that's just a really interesting thing as far as quilt design. That's a good way of checking yourself on your units. It's a good habit to get into, particularly if you're wanting to learn more about precision piecing. And I have a book on precision piecing you might want to check out, and it's called How to Piece Perfect Quilts, and that can certainly help you understand more about this. Okay, so the next step to this block is to attach the borders, and these are beautiful strips of scrappy fabric, and I think I'll switch these two because this one's got orange and that'll look good with that scrap of blue right there. And you know, you can get really persnickety about this. I got the same polka dot on this side, so it's like I can't win, right? So you can be as persnickety about this as you want, but you're probably going to end up sometimes with some scraps being really, you know, the same fabrics being close to one another. But one thing I do want to note, and this was just interesting that all of this ended up happening in this particular block. This block is going to come out an odd size, a not normal quilting size, meaning it's not ending up with a 1/2 inch. So when you piece this strip together, you're going to piece your pieces together and then you're going to trim it on both sides just a little bit shorter to come out the right size. So make sure to refer to your pattern to know exactly what size to trim that down. And before you trim your border, measure your block so that way you know exactly what it is. And if your block hasn't come out the right size, well then you can trim your borders to fit it. And the world's not going to end. Actually, that'll serve you just fine. That will work out a-okay. Now the last borders, these longer borders, have an extra feature. They've got a square in the square unit. These smaller ones piece to both sides. And again, before you piece those on, you want to go on ahead and measure your block and trim that strip of scrappy strips up. So that way it's going to fit properly. So you're going to piece that to one side and the other, and of course we have another extra border of background strips that'll go around it, and here's what it's going to look like whenever you finish your square in a square surprise. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed piecing this beautiful block with me. Now if you'd like to find the pattern and join in the fun of the Friendship Sampler Quilt Along, come and find the patterns at leahday.com/friendship. You can join in the fun anytime and work at your own pace. This is the 10th block in the series, but you can get started anytime, even if it's years after I first shared this quilt along. So come and pick up the patterns at leahday.com/friendship. Until next time, let's go quilt.